On October 2nd, 2018, journalist Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and never walked out. Investigators later said he was killed shortly after entering, and his body was never recovered. But here's what should terrify you about how this happened. Around that time, spyware called Pegasus was allegedly used to monitor the phones of people close to Khashoggi. Not his phone, the phones of his associates. A weapon he never touched may have helped track him anyway. This is invisible control in its purest form, power exerted without the target ever knowing they're being watched, mapped, and contained. And the question that should keep you awake at night is simple. How did we get here? How did we go from ancient kings sending spies on horseback to malware that can silently infiltrate the smartphone in your pocket right now, listening, tracking, and reporting, while you live your life like nothing is wrong? If you want more stories like this, subscribe, because this is only the beginning. What evolution in the machinery of power connects a Persian emperor's informants to software that can turn your phone into a surveillance device you carry everywhere, that watches you, listens to you, tracks you, and you never know what's happening? This is the story of invisible control. How it began 2,500 years ago. How it evolved through every empire that rose and fell. How it reached its technological apotheosis in a piece of spyware so powerful that it can compromise presidents, journalists, and activists with a single missed call. And how that same spyware is being used right now, today, by governments around the world to monitor, intimidate, and, in some cases, help kill the people who dare to speak truth to power. The desire to secretly monitor and control subjects isn't new. It's as old as civilization itself. The moment the first empire formed, the first emperor understood a fundamental truth about power. Information is the ultimate weapon. And the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy doesn't know exists. Ancient Persia understood this perfectly. The Achaemenid Empire, ruling from 550 to 330 BC, controlled territory spanning from Egypt to India. Managing an empire that vast, that diverse, required more than just armies. It required intelligence. The Persian kings created a system called the eyes and ears of the king. These were royal inspectors who traveled the empire in secret, observing provincial governors, monitoring local officials, reporting back to the emperor on loyalty, corruption, and potential rebellion. The genius of the system was its invisibility. A governor in Babylon wouldn't know when the eyes were watching. A satrap in Egypt couldn't tell if his servants were reporting to the emperor. The threat was always present, always possible, never confirmed. This is invisible control. Not the army at your gates, not the tax collector at your door, the informant you can't see, the watcher. You can't identify. The report filed in secret that determines your fate. And every empire that followed understood the lesson Persia taught. Visible power, armies and laws, controls territory. Invisible power, spies and informants, controls minds. Fast forward to Rome, 2nd century AD. The empire had grown too vast to manage through visible force alone. Emperor Hadrian needed intelligence on what was happening in the provinces. Tax revenue, military loyalty, potential uprisings. So he took an existing corps called the frumentarii, originally grain collectors for the army, and transformed them into something else entirely, imperial spies. By the 3rd century, the frumentarii had become the most feared organization in the Roman Empire. They operated everywhere. They reported on everyone. Roman historian Aurelius Victor wrote that their surveillance was rampant. Villagers lived enslaved by fear because the frumentarii were everywhere and nowhere. You didn't know who was watching. You didn't know who was reporting. You just knew that speaking against the emperor could mean a knock at your door in the middle of the night. The frumentarii didn't just spy. They raided homes under the pretext of hunting traders, then extorted the owners. They opened private correspondence. They infiltrated social gatherings. They created a climate where trust died because anyone could be an informant. Here's why this matters. This is the evolution of invisible control. Persia used it to manage an empire. Rome used it to terrorize one. The mechanism is the same. The intensity escalates. And the pattern repeats through history because it works. Jump forward to Nazi Germany. The Gestapo, the secret state police, operate on the same principle the frumentarii perfected 700 years earlier. Informants everywhere. Surveillance of everyone. Fear as the control mechanism. Neighbors reported neighbors. Children reported parents. The invisible network of watchers made resistance almost impossible because you could never know who was watching, who was listening, who would report your words to the authorities. Or Mao's China. Neighborhood committees monitored every household. Block captains reported on political loyalty. The invisible eyes of the state were embedded in the fabric of daily life. Speak against the party in your own home, and your neighbor might denounce you the next morning. But the 20th century produced one system that brought control without confrontation to its absolute peak. A surveillance state so comprehensive, so intrusive, so psychologically devastating, that it serves as the ultimate warning of what happens when governments decide to know everything about everyone. East Germany. 1950 to 1989. The Ministry for State Security, known as the Stasi, created the most thorough surveillance apparatus in human history. The numbers are staggering. In a country of 17 million people, the Stasi employed 90,000 full-time officers and 170,000 unofficial informants. That's one watcher for every 6.5 citizens. By comparison, the Soviet KGB had one agent for every 595 citizens. The Nazi Gestapo, one for every 2,000. The Stasi was an order of magnitude more intrusive than anything that came before. Their stated mission was to know everything about everyone, and they came terrifyingly close to achieving it. The Stasi planted listening devices in apartments. They steamed open mail, photographed the contents, resealed it, and delivered it so the target never knew. They recruited friends to inform on friends, husbands to inform on wives. They maintained files on 6 million people, more than a third of the entire population. If you lived in East Germany, the Stasi had a file on you. What you said, who you met, what you read, where you went, your political reliability, your sexual habits, everything. The psychological impact was total. Even when you weren't being actively monitored, you had to assume you might be. So you policed your own thoughts. You censored your own words. You learned to live in a state of permanent self-surveillance because the invisible watchers were always potentially there. The ultimate power of a surveillance state isn't punishment. It's when people police their own thoughts out of fear. The fear of being watched becomes the watcher. The possibility of surveillance becomes the surveillance. And an entire society folds inward, crushed under the weight of eyes that may or may not be there but can never be escaped. The Stasi fell in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. But here's the twist. Quick question, did you already know the Stasi was this extensive? Drop a yes or no in the comments. The model survived. Because while the Stasi's methods were analog, listening devices, and paper files, the principle was digital ready. Know everything about everyone. Make privacy impossible. Use information as control. And when the digital age arrived, that principle found a new home. But digital didn't just replicate the Stasi model. It made it cheap, effortless, global. Then came the technological revolutions that would transform invisible control from a labor-intensive operation requiring armies of informants into something that could be automated, scaled, and deployed globally. World War II introduced signals, intelligence, code-breaking, wiretapping. Intercepting enemy communications became a decisive military advantage. The breaking of the German Enigma code by Alan Turing and his team at Bletchley Park helped win the war by giving the Allies access to Nazi military plans. The lesson was clear. If you can read your enemy's secrets, you can defeat them before they even know you're watching. The Cold War took this principle and industrialized it. The United States and its allies created Echelon, a global surveillance network that intercepted satellite communications, phone calls, faxes, and emails across the world. For decades, most people didn't know Echelon existed. It operated in the shadows, vacuuming up communications from millions of people, sorting through the data for intelligence targets. This was invisible control at a new scale. Not hundreds of informants in a single city, satellites and computers monitoring the entire planet. But the world didn't fully understand how far digital surveillance had advanced until 2013. That's when a 29-year-old NSA contractor named Edward Snowden walked out of his office in Hawaii with classified documents that would expose the most extensive peacetime surveillance operation in human history. Snowden revealed programs with names like PRISM, XKeyscore, and Boundless Informant. He showed that the National Security Agency was collecting phone records from millions of Americans who had committed no crime, that the NSA was tapping into the servers of Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft to access emails, photos, and private messages, that the intelligence community had built a system capable of monitoring virtually every digital communication on Earth. The justification was counterterrorism. The reality was mass surveillance on a scale that would have made the Stasi weep with envy, because the Stasi needed 170,000 informants to monitor 17 million people. The NSA could monitor billions with a few hundred analysts and some very sophisticated algorithms. This was the critical turning point. Technology had made invisible control nearly costless. You didn't need to recruit informants. You didn't need to steam open mail. You just needed access to the digital networks that everyone was already using voluntarily. People were carrying their own tracking devices, creating their own surveillance files, documenting their own lives in emails, texts, photos, location data. The infrastructure of control was already built. The NSA just had to tap into it. But even the NSA's programs had limitations. They collected metadata, the records of who called whom, when, for how long. They accessed emails and messages stored on servers. But that wasn't the breakthrough. Mass collection isn't the same as owning a phone. They couldn't, at least not easily, turn your phone into a live surveillance device. They couldn't activate your camera without you knowing. They couldn't record your conversations in real time while your phone sat in your pocket. That would require something more invasive, something more personal, something like Pegasus. In 2016, a human rights activist in the United Arab Emirates named Ahmed Mansour received a text message. It promised information about torture happening in UAE prisons. All he had to do was click the link. Mansour didn't click. He was suspicious. He'd been targeted before. So he forwarded the message to researchers at Citizen Lab, a digital rights organization at the University of Toronto. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about smartphone security. The link contained a zero-day exploit, a previously unknown vulnerability in Apple's iOS software that would have silently installed spyware on Mansour's iPhone if he'd clicked it. The spyware was called Pegasus. It was created by an Israeli company called NSO Group, and it was the most sophisticated mobile surveillance tool ever discovered. Citizen Lab analyzed the code and realized they were looking at something unprecedented. Pegasus works in 3 stages. First, delivery, initially through malicious links, later through zero-click exploits that require no action from the target. Second, privilege escalation. It burrows into the operating system itself, below the level where your apps run, below where encryption protects you. Third, exfiltration. Once it's in, it can do anything the phone can do. It could read every message, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, encrypted or not. Pegasus could access them all. It could copy every photo and video stored on the device. It could record phone calls, both the calls you made and the conversations happening around the phone when you thought it wasn't listening. It could track your GPS location in real time, everywhere you went, every meeting you attended, every person you met. It could activate your camera without the camera light turning on, turning your phone into a secret video recorder. It could activate your microphone, turning your phone into a permanent listening device that captured every conversation in the room, even when the phone appeared to be off. Here's the key. Encryption protects data in transit. Pegasus reads it at the source, on your phone, before encryption even happens. Your phone, the device you carry everywhere, that knows everything about you, could be turned against you, and you would never know. A borderless secret police in your pocket. If you're still watching, hit like. It tells YouTube this topic matters. But it gets worse. Now comes zero-click. This is where it becomes unfair. In the early versions, Pegasus required some action from the target. You had to click a malicious link. You had to download a file. Citizen Lab's discovery of the Mansour attack led Apple to patch the vulnerability. NSO Group went back to work, and they developed something terrifying: zero-click exploits. By 2019, Pegasus could be installed without the target doing anything at all. Simply receiving a WhatsApp call, you didn't even have to answer it, could silently install Pegasus on your phone. The call would come through. You'd see a missed call notification. And in those few seconds, Pegasus would exploit a vulnerability in WhatsApp's code to gain access to your entire device. Apple's iMessage had similar vulnerabilities. Security researchers discovered that Pegasus could be delivered through invisible iMessages that never even appeared in your message history. You wouldn't see anything. No notification, no indication anything had happened. But your phone was now owned by whoever sent the message. Think about what this means. You cannot protect yourself through behavior. Being careful, not clicking suspicious links, doesn't help when the attack requires no clicks. Using encrypted messaging apps doesn't help when Pegasus operates below the encryption layer. Keeping your software updated doesn't help when Pegasus uses zero-day exploits, vulnerabilities that haven't been discovered yet, that no patch can fix until after you've already been compromised. The cyber-savvy and the cyber-illiterate are equally vulnerable. The technology journalist and the grandmother with her first smartphone face the same risk. Because Pegasus doesn't care who you are or what you know, it just needs your phone number. And NSO Group sold this power to governments around the world. The official line was that Pegasus would only be used for counterterrorism and fighting serious crime. NSO Group claimed they had strict controls, that they vetted their clients, that abuse would not be tolerated. To be fair, governments do face real threats. Terrorism exists. Organized crime operates. Across borders, kidnapping rings, drug cartels, human trafficking networks. Intelligence services need tools to stop genuine dangers. The problem isn't that surveillance tools exist. The problem is mission creep. Once a tool like Pegasus exists, it doesn't stay contained to terrorists and criminals. It spreads to political opponents, to journalists, to activists, to anyone the government considers inconvenient. And history shows repeatedly that those limits fail. NSO Group was either lying about their controls, or they were willfully blind to how their clients were using the weapon they'd built. Let me show you what actually happened when governments got their hands on Pegasus. Spain, 2019 to 2020, Catalonia, the northeastern region of Spain, had been pushing for independence. The Spanish government opposed this, and in April 2020, researchers discovered that at least 65 individuals connected to the Catalan independence movement had their phones infected with Pegasus. Activists, lawyers, politicians, all under surveillance. Jordi Solé, a member of the European Parliament representing Catalonia, handed his phone to security researchers. They discovered it had been infected twice, once in 2019, once in 2020. During the times his phone was compromised, everything on his device was accessible. Confidential political strategy meetings, private conversations with fellow independence advocates, messages to journalists, all of it potentially monitored by Spanish intelligence services. Solé described the atmosphere after the discovery. Paranoia and mistrust descended on the entire independence movement. People stopped trusting their phones, started assuming every conversation was monitored. Solé told reporters he was astonished that such surveillance could happen in a democratic country, that the revelation was unbelievable, but it was real. Spain, a Western democracy, member of the European Union and NATO, was using Pegasus against its own citizens for political purposes. Not terrorism, not serious crime. Political dissent. This is invisible control operating in the heart of the democratic world. The watchers aren't authoritarians in a distant dictatorship. They're elected governments using surveillance against their own people to suppress movements they don't like. But Catalonia was just the beginning. Researchers at organizations like Citizen Lab, Amnesty International, and Forbidden Stories began investigating Pegasus more deeply. What they found was a global surveillance operation targeting civil society, journalists investigating government corruption, infected, human rights lawyers defending political prisoners, infected, opposition leaders challenging authoritarian regimes, infected. And investigators documented many cases where Pegasus targeting coincided with break-ins, intimidation, arrests, assaults, and in some contexts, even murder. Let me walk you through the pattern. El Salvador, journalists at El Faro, an investigative news outlet, discovered their phones were infected during 2020 and 2021. This was after they'd published stories on secret negotiations between the government and criminal gangs. The timing wasn't coincidental. The surveillance was clearly aimed at discovering their sources, intimidating them, and potentially identifying confidential informants who could then be silenced. In Mexico, Citizen Lab documented infection attempts on the phones of journalists investigating cartel violence and government corruption. These weren't abstract violations of privacy. These are life and death stakes. Pegasus infections create maps of relationships. They reveal sources. They expose safe houses. They identify who's talking to whom. And in countries where journalism is dangerous, where activism can be fatal, that information gets people killed. But the targeting went even higher than journalists and activists. In July 2021, the Pegasus Project, a collaboration between 17 media organizations, published the results of a massive investigation. They'd obtained a list of more than 50,000 phone numbers that had been selected as potential targets for Pegasus surveillance. The list included 14 heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, among them French President Emmanuel Macron. The phone number of a sitting French president, leader of a G7 nation, nuclear power, and permanent UN Security Council member, appeared as a potential target for Pegasus surveillance. Forensic analysis confirmed that phones belonging to members of Macron's cabinet and close associates were indeed infected. Think about what this represents. Not a dictator spying on dissidents, not an autocracy monitoring journalists. One government spying on the leader of another government. Heads of state, people who command armies, who hold nuclear codes, who negotiate treaties that affect billions of people, those people cannot escape Pegasus. Amnesty International said it plainly. Even those at the highest levels of power cannot escape the sinister spread of NSO's spyware. This is the full evolution of invisible control. It started with Persian kings spying on provincial governors. It ends with everyone spying on everyone, from activists to presidents, all vulnerable to a piece of code that fits on a phone. The balance of power is shattered. The emperors are now spied on just like the subjects. And the tool that makes it possible is sold by a private company for profit. But let's go back to where we started. Jamal Khashoggi. On October 2nd, 2018, Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Saudi agents killed him. His body was dismembered. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman initially denied involvement, then admitted the killing was a rogue operation, then eventually accepted responsibility while denying he ordered it. The world condemned the murder. But the question remained, how did the Saudis know Khashoggi's movements? How did they know when he'd be at the consulate, alone, vulnerable? Forensic investigators analyzed the phones of people close to Khashoggi, his associates, his confidants. Citizen Lab found evidence of Pegasus infections on multiple devices in Khashoggi's inner circle. The infections occurred in the months before his death. The timing is damning. The implication is clear. Saudi intelligence used Pegasus to monitor the people around Khashoggi, to track his communications, to map his network, to know his schedule, and potentially to coordinate the operation that killed him. NSO Group denies that Pegasus was used in connection with the Khashoggi murder. They point out that they don't operate the software, their government clients do, and they claim they investigate abuse when it's reported. But denial doesn't change the forensic evidence. Pegasus was on the phones of people close to a man who was murdered by a government that was an NSO client. This is invisible control used to facilitate assassination. A journalist carrying a phone, his friends carrying phones. Those phones turned into tracking devices, and the man dies. The weapon that killed Khashoggi wasn't a bone saw. The bone saw was just the final step. The weapon was information, invisible, silent, and delivered through spyware that Khashoggi never even saw. So the question becomes, after all this exposure, after the Pegasus Project revelations in July 2021, what happened? Did the world wake up? Did governments crack down? Did the invisible empire of spyware get dismantled? The short answer is no. The revelations sparked outrage. Civil liberties organizations condemned NSO Group. Tech companies went to war. In November 2021, the United States Commerce Department added NSO Group to a trade blacklist, saying their activities were contrary to U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. Apple filed a lawsuit against NSO Group, seeking to hold them accountable for targeting iPhone users. WhatsApp had already sued in 2019 over the WhatsApp call exploit. Multiple countries launched investigations. France opened a probe into the targeting of Macron and other officials. India's Supreme Court ordered an inquiry into allegations that Pegasus was used to spy on opposition politicians and journalists. Spain, Poland, Hungary all faced domestic pressure to explain their government's use of spyware. Parliamentary hearings were held, reports were written, some officials resigned. But here's the reality. 1 year after the Pegasus Project revelations, Amnesty International issued a damning assessment. The spyware industry was still operating. Pegasus was still being used. And governments had failed to impose meaningful regulations that would prevent further abuse. NSO Group claimed they'd reformed their processes. They said they'd terminated contracts with some clients. They insisted they were the good guys. But new infections kept appearing. Journalists in El Salvador discovered Pegasus on their phones in 2022 after the revelations. Activists in Poland were targeted in 2021 and 2022 during the investigations. Moroccan human rights defenders found infections dating to 2022 and 2023. The surveillance continued because the demand continued. Governments want Pegasus because it works, because invisible control is the most effective control, because monitoring journalists, activists, and political opponents in secret is easier than confronting them in public. And NSO Group, despite the lawsuits and blacklists, kept selling because surveillance is profitable. This isn't over. The technology exists. The market exists. And until governments agree to a global ban on the sale and use of mercenary spyware, companies like NSO will continue profiting from human rights violations on a global scale. Think about the arc of history we've traveled. From Persian kings sending inspectors to monitor governors, to Roman emperors deploying secret police to terrorize provinces, to East Germany building a surveillance state where 1 in 6 people were watchers, to the NSA collecting metadata on billions, to a private company selling spyware that turns phones into personal tracking devices. The means have changed. The ends are the same. Power through information, control through surveillance, the invisible hand that shapes behavior because you never know when you're being watched. But technology has made invisible control exponentially more powerful. The Stasi needed 170,000 informants. Pegasus needs 1 phone number. The Frumentarii had to physically raid homes. Pegasus silently copies everything in your digital home while you sleep. The eyes and ears of the king took weeks to travel and report. Pegasus transmits in real time. Every technological leap that made our lives easier, mobile phones, the internet, encrypted messaging, also made surveillance easier. The same tools that connect us can be weaponized to control us, and we're carrying those tools everywhere, all the time. The human cost of this evolution is incalculable. A Salvadoran journalist, after discovering Pegasus on his phone, described the psychological impact. He called it a very violent form of censorship. He said the goal wasn't just to steal information. The goal was to make you paranoid, isolate you, lock you in a prison of fear where you can't trust your phone, your friends, your own thoughts. This is the ultimate invisible control. It doesn't just steal data. It steals freedom. The freedom to speak without fear. The freedom to organize without surveillance. The freedom to think without wondering if someone is listening. Those freedoms, the foundations of every open society, are eroded when invisible control becomes pervasive. When you have to assume your phone might be compromised. When journalists have to assume their sources might be exposed, when activists have to assume their plans might be monitored, when even presidents have to assume foreign intelligence services might be reading their messages, society changes, trust dies. The space for dissent shrinks. and power concentrates in the hands of those who control the surveillance tools. We've seen this pattern before. Rome's empire grew more oppressive as the frumentaria spread. East Germany became a nation of informants terrified to speak. Every society that embraced invisible control saw freedom contract and fear expand. The difference now is scale. The Stasi monitored 17 million people in one country over 40 years. Pegasus can monitor billions across every country in weeks. And the surveillance infrastructure isn't going away. It's expanding. More companies are developing spyware. Kendiru, an Israeli firm. Cytrox from North Macedonia. NSO Group has competitors, and they're all selling to governments. More governments are buying, not just autocracies. Democracies too. Spain, Poland, Hungary, India, Mexico, all confirmed or credibly accused of using Pegasus. The United States refused to use Pegasus domestically, but the FBI acquired and tested an NSO tool, though they said it wasn't used in investigations. Every government wants the capability because every government believes its reasons for surveillance are justified. National security, public safety, counterterrorism. And some uses probably are justified. There are terrorists. There are criminals. Intelligence services do need tools to stop genuine threats, but the tool doesn't limit itself. The people operating it do. And history shows, repeatedly, that those limits fail, so we face a choice. We can accept that control without confrontation is now a permanent feature of modern life, that privacy is dead, that powerful surveillance tools in the hands of governments and corporations are inevitable, that we should just assume we're being watched and adjust our behavior accordingly, or we can resist. But resistance requires three things. First, policy. Push for restrictions on mercenary spyware. International agreements that ban the sale of surveillance tools to human rights abusers. This won't solve everything, but it raises the cost. Second, understand the tech reality. Perfect security doesn't exist. Zero-day exploits are found constantly. But update cycles matter. Keeping your device updated closes known vulnerabilities. It's not immunity, but it's friction. Third, if you're high risk, a journalist, an activist, someone who might be targeted, assume device compromise is possible. Separate sensitive communications. Use multiple devices. Understand that your smartphone is potentially a skeleton key to your entire life. But resistance requires awareness first. You can't fight what you can't see. And that's the entire point of invisible control. It works because it's invisible. The moment you see it, the moment you understand how pervasive the surveillance is, how vulnerable your devices are, how thoroughly the infrastructure of control has been built into the technology you use every day, that's the moment you can start fighting back. The Persian kings controlled an empire through informants you couldn't identify. The Roman emperors terrorized provinces through spies you couldn't see. The Stasi crushed East Germany through surveillance you couldn't escape. The NSA collected data on billions through systems you didn't know existed. And now Pegasus and tools like it represent the endpoint of this evolution. Your phone, the most intimate device you own, can be turned into a weapon against you, and you'll never know until it's too late. This is the empire of surveillance without borders. It doesn't have a capital. It exists in code and vulnerabilities, in the silent monitoring of billions of devices. And it's growing. But empires fall. The Persians fell to Alexander. Rome collapsed under its own weight. The Stasi died with the Berlin Wall. The NSA's secrets were exposed by Snowden. And Pegasus, for all its power, is now known. The invisible has been made visible. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we accept the new normal of pervasive surveillance? Or do we demand that the tools of invisible control be dismantled before they turn every phone into a tracking device, every citizen into a suspect, every society into a digital panopticon where freedom exists only in the spaces that power chooses not to watch? The Jamal Khashoggi case showed us the stakes. Invisible control doesn't just violate privacy, it enables murder. The Catalan activists showed us the scope. Democracies use these tools too. The targeting of presidents showed us the reach. No one is safe. And the continued use of Pegasus after the revelations shows us the truth. The empire of invisible control isn't going to dismantle itself. It will only grow until we force it to stop. That's the lesson from Persia to Pegasus. Power seeks control. Control seeks invisibility. And invisible control, once achieved, is never surrendered voluntarily. Every empire that wielded it believed it was permanent. Every empire that wielded it eventually fell. The question for our time is whether we'll wait for this empire to collapse under its own abuses, or whether we'll see the danger now while there's still time to choose a different path. A path where technology serves transparency, not surveillance, where privacy is a right, not a relic, where the invisible watchers are seen, named, and stopped. The rise of invisible control took 2,500 years. The fall could take far less, but only if we choose to push. If you want the next episode, how spyware spreads through the global market and who buys it, comment next.